Thank you. Senator Ludlam.
Look, thanks, Mr Acting Deputy President. I'm pleased to be able to speak to this matter this morning that Senator Hanson-Young has brought forward for consideration of the Senate. Senator Hanson-Young outlined that the bill that's before us amends the Migration Act 1958 to allow Section 85 limit on visas to be disallowable. We've not said at any time that the minister shouldn't be able to set these caps, but nonetheless, ministers who have discretionary powers within their portfolios to make these decisions without the need to put something to Parliament, if it's a matter as grave as this, a decision to place an indeterminate freeze on a human being's livelihood, we don't think that should simply be left to the discretion of a minister of the day at the stroke of a pen. So it's not the caps that we'd necessarily take issue with, it's the fact that those caps should be disallowable. I commend Senator Hanson-Young for her determination, not just in bringing this bill forward, because this is just a small piece of a much larger puzzle, as other senators have identified, but for her determined opposition to inhumane policies that we read over the last 24 hours now amount to torture. Torture of human beings. And the government's highly politicised and very deliberate and systematic move to attempt to militarise the problem and mischaracterise a humanitarian crisis as a military one is precisely the reason why you're failing. It's the reason why the wheels have come off. It's a disgrace what is being done to the Australian Defence Force, hiding behind uniforms of servicemen and women who signed up to defend their country, not to be dragged into the vile and politicised debate over some of the most vulnerable people on earth who, when they take the risk that they know may well lead to the deaths of themselves and their children, take the risk to come to this country, are faced not with an orderly and legal and legitimate processing regime, but they're faced with gunboats, with slogans, with ministers standing in front of banners, and with vilification. And it's killing people. And you know that it is, and that's why it is such a disaster that you continue nonetheless. To have an organisation with the gravitas and record of Amnesty International describing Manus Island, the detention centre there, as cruel, inhuman, degrading and violating prohibitions against torture in the recent report by Amnesty. This is an organisation that exposes itself by way of the resourcing of its members and its volunteers and people around the world who care about issues like this. This is an organisation that exposes itself to some of the worst practices and worst hellholes in the world. And for them to accuse an Australian government effectively of torturing people blows me away that Coalition MPs can even show their faces in here and defend this practice this morning without some kind of apology. It is my strong view that what we are setting up here is an apology for a future Prime Minister who will have to do what Prime Minister Rudd did in 2008, long overdue, to stand and apologise on behalf of the entire country to a cohort of people who were abused with the consent of the executive and of the government of the day. That's what we're setting up here, a situation where a future Prime Minister will need to apologise on behalf of the country to the people who have been abused and damaged and lost through the government's misguided and quite violent asylum seeker policies. The centre at Manus has obviously been very difficult for journalists to access, but I congratulate Amnesty International and everybody around the world, and certainly in this country, who work in support of asylum seekers, whether it's to try and change policy, groups like the Refugee Rights Action Network in Western Australia, who do a mix of very determined advocacy, but they also take themselves into detention centres, see what they can do, get toys and books into the detention centres, form friendships with people who are inside, and then do the best that they can to look after them when they're out. Groups like the ASRC in Victoria, who again perform the kind of really basic tasks like counselling people who have fallen through our detention centres and come out traumatised with post-traumatic stress disorder, lay it on top of whatever it was that they were fleeing from in the first place. And it makes me feel ashamed to be Australian when you read that our worst fears have been confirmed, that the horror that we are inflicting on people amounts to torture. It's something that obviously we suspected for a long period of time, and all those who have opposed the policies of this government, and when the wheels fell off the ALP, the former government's policy, and they followed now Prime Minister Tony Abbott into the gutter on asylum seeker policies, the people remained defiant and stayed with the campaign all the way through. Now, what is happening this morning is that we're acknowledging that the implications of a freeze on protection visas are devastating. It looked like nothing more than a tit-for-tat tactic of a child, of a 5-year-old child throwing his toys out of the cot after the disallowance of TPVs went through last week between the Greens and the ALP. And Minister, looking around for some kind of political tactic to retaliate, didn't choose a political tactic to retaliate, he chose to make the lives of human beings even more miserable. Well played. These are refugees, including women and children who are being detained in immigration detention, some for years, more than 4 years, who are currently living on bridging visas with the right to work, and those who are subject to community detention who will never now be granted permanent protection in Australia. And the freeze condemns these refugees to a life of fear and uncertainty. I've spent, as I suspect many of us have here, and I know Senator Hanson-Young certainly has, spent a measure of time in some of these detention centres as the situation has gradually become more and more degraded and got worse and worse, until you're forced to confront the realisation that conditions inside detention centres offshore and onshore aren't degraded and vile by accident. They are like that deliberately. We are trying to persuade people who have fled war zones and risk of torture and killings and disappearances, as is still occurring in Sri Lanka, that they're better off staying under those circumstances than they are fleeing to the protection of Australia. One of the people interviewed in this Amnesty International report says the following. This is a 43-year-old gentleman from Iraqi, that's my age. And this gentleman says, "I've lived in war zones with bombs and explosions. I've never experienced what I'm experiencing here with the uncertainty that we face. If we had died on the ocean, that would have been better." Which means, Senator Cash, you're getting close. You're getting close to your policy objective of being more terrifying and worse than war. Is that really what you're setting out to do? If it is, you should just jump up and say so. And I suspect people like myself would probably breathe a sigh of relief that you're no longer pretending that it's for the best interests of the people who you're looking after, who have fled and exercised their international legal rights to seek asylum. To have you then say it's for the best, we're trying to prevent drownings at sea, I don't think you are. And it pains me to say that, because if you go back over the last few years, I figured there was a genuine will within this parliament, at least for a period of time, to try and do everything that could be done to prevent deaths at sea. And the Australian Greens believe, obviously, that the best way of doing that is to provide a safe pathway for people. But I don't think that has ever been what the coalition has been about. It has been about turning a humanitarian emergency into a national security one, because that's where you think you're on safe ground. Parade gunboats, parade men and women in uniform to provoke fear in the community and then rescue people from that fear. It's disgraceful. It's a very old political tactic. It's not something that I think should be pursued any further. And what I hope the most is that you will see just how badly it's failing when you try and convert a humanitarian crisis into a national security one. There is no doubt at all that your tactics will fail, but this is not merely a political question, because lives are at risk, because people's futures are at risk. As of May 2013, there were 1,731 children still locked up in Australian detention centres. Children who have arrived as asylum seekers have already experienced severe traumas. So you might want to think about your apology, about the future apology that a Prime Minister will need to make to those children who committed no crime, either in Australia or in the countries that they fled from. The only thing that they appear to have done wrong, whether they came here with their parents or not, was arrive at a time when the politics of people fleeing and seeking refuge is as degraded as it has ever been, certainly in my political memory. The reason I think that Minister Morrison has chosen this tactic, as I said earlier, is because he wanted some way of maybe mitigating the humiliation that he might have felt about the TPV disallowance last week. But temporary protection visas don't work as a deterrent, and I would have thought, as those of you who were in government during the Howard years at the time of the Civex disaster would know very, very well, viscerally in fact, just how poorly TPVs fail as a deterrent and as a policy instrument. In 1999, when they were introduced, they did nothing whatsoever to stop the flow of asylum seekers by boat. In fact, it probably had the reverse effect. In the 2 years prior to the introduction of TPVs, a little over 1,000 people, 1,078 people arrived by boat. In the first 2 years following them, 8,312 people arrived by boat. And you know this well, by denying family reunion, more women and children were then forced to take the perilous boat journey to Australia. But it's as though we're operating in a fact-free environment where, as long as you front up and just a little bit more hairy-chested today than you were yesterday or the day before that, you'll be able to get the headline that you're strong on border protection and strong on national security, while behind the scenes people are traumatised and now camped in situations that amount to torture in the detention centres, where it's actually very, very difficult to get an independent and objective view of what's going on there. So on behalf of the Australian Greens, those of us who are fleeing the building to spend time with loved ones over the holiday season, take a break, we will not forget the plight of those who came to Australia seeking a better life, for whatever reason, fleeing some of the worst regimes and situations anywhere on earth, who are locked up behind razor wire, with or without their children, not knowing whether their family are safe and whether or not they will be protected, for whom the idea of Australia as a beacon of democracy and human rights and well-being in the region have been exposed as a cruel joke. So I do wish everyone in this chamber well, time over the break to reflect on the impact that the policies and the bills and the measures that we pass in here have on the lives of real human beings. And I'm proud to stand with those in the community who utterly reject the policies of this government as they've tripped from failure to disaster to one scandal after another, hiding behind the uniforms of the ADF, and that we will not rest until these policies have been reversed, and that we have a policy that respects international law, that respects human rights, and that respects the individual aspirations of the people who seek refuge here when there's nowhere else to go.